Elite, Rala, Carrot. You might not recognize these names, but in the 1960s, they all belonged to a single, unexpected star of the Soviet automotive industry, the Moskvich 408. How did a small Soviet sedan, built for the working class, manage to break through the Iron Curtain and conquer capitalist export markets? What did British car critics really think of it? How did the eccentric Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev try to build a communist convertible? And most importantly, what killed this iconic car? Stick around. Today, we're diving deep into the rise, the global success, and the ultimate fall of one of the most famous Soviet cars in history. Drop a like, and let's get started. The story of the people's car, Moskvich, actually began under Joseph Stalin right after World War II, heavily relying on German engineers and the design of the Opel Kadett. But by the 1950s, that design belonged in a museum. Desperate to keep up with the global automotive trends dictated by Detroit, Moscow engineers began working on a new generation. After a few transitional models, they finally struck gold. The second generation Moskvich became an instant hit, not just at home, but abroad. Believe it or not, about half of all these cars were exported to the West. The Soviet Union desperately needed hard capitalist currency, and these cheap, sturdy cars were the perfect export product. But the Soviets faced a major problem: the fast-paced car fashion of the West. It was as unpredictable as spring weather. In the late 1950s, Detroit changed trends almost every year. First came the bubbly aerodynamic shapes, then the massive tail fins, and finally, a shift towards pragmatic, flat panels. The Soviet-planned economy simply couldn't pivot that fast. As a result, the Moskvich 408, finally approved for production in 1964, looked like a crash course in Darwinian evolution. It featured the new modern straight lines, but still kept weird, tiny tail fin rudiments on the rear fenders, complete with rocket-style turn signals. Despite the mixed styling, it was a massive step forward. It had a lowered silhouette, larger windows, and a relatively spacious cabin. However, inside it was pure communist austerity. Cheap vinyl seats, unpainted metal pillars, and a massive steering wheel with a column-mounted shifter. Under the hood sat a 1.3-liter engine producing a modest 50 horsepower paired with a 4-speed manual. The suspension was a mix, independent at the front but archaic leaf springs at the rear. But in the Soviet Union, archaic meant durable. The Moskvich had a thick steel unibody frame that could survive brutal, unpaved Russian roads. It was a simple machine with no complex electronics, and that was crucial because in the USSR, normal service stations basically didn't exist. If you owned a Moskvich, you became your own mechanic. Millions of Soviet men turned their cramped garages into weekend service stations. It birthed an entire garage subculture, a male sanctuary where fixing the car was often just a great excuse to drink with friends away from the wives. So, did the Moskvich become a cheap, mass-market legend like the Volkswagen Beetle? Not quite. It cost 4,500 rubles. The average Soviet worker made about 100 rubles a month. That meant you had to save every single penny you earned for nearly 4 years, just to afford the base price. And even if you had the cash, you couldn't just walk into a dealership. You had to join a government waiting list and wait anywhere from 5 to 10 years for the privilege of buying one. That's why Soviet citizens kept their cars for a lifetime, eventually passing them down to their children. But while Soviet citizens waited in line, the Moskvich was making a splash in the West. In October 1964, it debuted at the Earl's Court Motor Show in London. By the next year, right-hand drive versions were selling in the UK. The export models were loaded. They had extra chrome, quad headlights, a floor shifter, and even a radio. In August 1967, iconic British magazines like Autocar and Motor put the Moskvich to the test. Their verdict? It was an incredible bargain, but it had quirks. The main target for mockery was the weak engine. Reaching 60 miles per hour was a painful, agonizing struggle. Reviewers noted that at 50 miles per hour, the engine screamed, the floor vibrated, and the transmission howled. It felt like you were flying a jet at Mach 2, but the speedometer barely registered highway speeds. The brakes were heavy, and the plastic interior felt cheap. Yet, it only cost 750 pounds, cheaper than a base Ford Cortina. For a tough, cheap-to-run car, Western buyers were willing to forgive its tractor-like handling. It sold as the Moskvich Elite in France, the Karat in Scandinavia, and was exported from the Netherlands all the way to Africa. In 1960, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev visited France and was gifted a gorgeous Renault Caravelle convertible. Khrushchev didn't care much for driving, so he shipped it back to the Moskvich plant and essentially told his engineers, "Build me a communist version." They actually did it. They chopped the roof off a Moskvich 408, reinforced the floor, added a red interior, and slapped on twin Weber carburetors. They called it the Moskvich Tourist. Sadly, it never saw production. When Leonid Brezhnev took power, the USSR shifted back to a conservative, utilitarian mindset. Convertibles were deemed a bourgeois excess. Only 2 prototypes were ever made. Throughout the late 60s and 70s, the Moskvich received numerous facelifts and engine upgrades. It even proved its toughness in grueling motorsport events like the 1970 London to Mexico World Cup Rally. But its golden age was over. The fatal blow didn't come from the West. It came from within. The Soviet government poured all its money into a massive new factory to build the Lada, known domestically as the Zhiguli, a licensed copy of the Fiat 124. The Lada was faster, more comfortable, and produced in the millions. Moskvich lost its funding. Its designs grew hopelessly outdated, and it slowly faded into obscurity before the factories finally shut down in the 90s. Today, the Moskvich 408 is a nostalgic symbol of a bygone era, a rugged survivor that briefly managed to bridge the gap between East and West. But what do you think? For a cheap 1960s economy car, was the Moskvich actually a solid deal, or just a Soviet tractor in a nice suit? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.